If you've watched my video on memorizing essays, I covered how I could do so for text response and comparative text response. But what I didn't cover was argument analysis. So that's what I'm going to do here because it is slightly different. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is impossible to memorize a full essay for argument analysis. However, it is possible to memorize parts and come up with a detailed template so that you can use it in most essays. Now, before I talk about it, I just want to say that the template that I'm going to show you does change from time to time, but for the most part, the ideas behind the sentences stay the same, which is the important part. So not so much the specific wording of each of the sentences, so you don't need to go and memorize my template, but if you understand the basic gist of it, it's going to give your writing more structure. And like the previous video, I'm not here to persuade you that you have to use this template. Feel free to just take what's helpful. But again, I'm just going over how I approached argument analysis, which is definitely not the only way. So with that being said, let's get started with the introduction. Okay, so for the introduction, I like to begin with my contextualizing sentence. Now there's lots of ways that you can phrase this, but the way I ended up choosing was this. So polarizing public discourse has proliferated as a result of, and then you just insert your background information, which you get from your article. So I quite like this because the alliteration here. And then next, I follow this up with the publication details. So weighing into the debate, the author, so insert the author's name, opinion article, so the author's opinion article, and then you add the publication details. So for example, the title or where it was published. And then you have the contention afterwards. And don't worry if this seems too abstract, I have an example after this. And then I move on to the audience, purpose, and argument type. Note that the argument type is very important because as of the new study design, you are required to pinpoint the type of argument. So if that's a logical argument, an emotional argument, a political argument, and so on. My structure here is appealing to insert your target audience. So for example, parents. The author presents a predominantly something argument, so if that's a logical argument, emotional argument, like I mentioned before, hoping to convince the audience to, and then you insert the purpose. So is it to persuade these parents to look after their child or something like that, whatever the purpose of the piece is. And then I like to finish with the image. So the piece is accompanied by an image showcasing and then briefly describe the visual, which then further supports. So this is quite important. You need to mention how the visual supports the author's contention. So that's what your next half is. Now, if there is another text, so if it's a comparative argument analysis, just repeat steps 2 to 4. So publication details, audience, purpose, argument type, and image. But you can condense that into a few sentences. So you don't need 3, maybe 1 or 2 is enough. Now, let's go through an example. Contextualizing sentence in red, polarizing public discourse has proliferated as a result of the increase in the number of cashless stores. So this is based off the 2019 exam. I have a video covering that if you're interested. And then in orange, I introduce the text with the publication details. So that's the title, where it was published. So for example, in a local newsletter. But the more important part of this sentence is the second half. So where I say responds to the issue by ardently lauding cashless stores, so praising cashless stores. So that's the author's contention here, and that's very important. And then moving on to the yellow part, so appealing to progressive customers. So that's the target audience. Astaire mounts a community-minded argument. You can see this argument is very focused on the community, and what her purpose is to urge her readership, so the audience, to accept the benefits of digital technology. So in other words, accept cashless shopping. And then moving on to our second piece, I talk about how Morricone aims to debunk Astaire's point of view and argues that cashless stores are inconvenient and have huge disadvantages associated. I didn't include everything like the argument type, audience, all in this one sentence. So don't feel like you need to do that as well, because otherwise your introductions might become too long. The main thing is to have your contention for your second piece, and anything else you can add to it is a bonus. And then I finish with my visuals, so you can either have this at the very end or you could have it before the green if the second text doesn't have a visual. And as a quick note, if you're struggling to find out what you should be writing for the audience or the argument type, don't worry, I have a list of vocab at the very end of this video. So have a look at that. And if you do have any questions after reading that, then you can ask me in the comments below. Now, moving on to our paragraphs. As you can imagine, we can't pre-prepare as much as for the introduction, but there are certain pieces that you can use in many essays. And one of those examples is the topic sentence. And regardless of whether it's a single argument analysis or a comparative argument analysis, the sentence structure is pretty much the same. Just if it's single, then don't mention author 2. So just have the first part of this topic sentence. While author 1 aims to do something, author 2 says something else. So for example, from the outset, Esther's social argument is designed to bolster the credibility of her store, while Morricone satirically declares this is not the case. From the outset, that's a very good phrase to have because it shows that you're aware of the location of the argument. Here, the authors are clearly doing something at the beginning of their piece that's very unique. And in this case, it's establishing their credibility. That's something they choose to do at the start rather than at the finish because they know if they don't establish their credibility from the outset or from the very beginning, then readers aren't going to listen to what they have to say. And if they only do that at the very end, well, they probably would have already lost a lot of readers. So here we're identifying why the authors establish their credibility so early on. They want their audiences to be more receptive to their following arguments. And you'll notice this is a trend that occurs in many VCAR essays. So if you are able to identify this is basically a couple of sentences that you don't have to spend thinking about every time you write a new essay, if you can just reuse the same idea. Now, some other sentences you can use include strategically commencing with a X argument or the use of a certain technique. So strategically commencing with a rhetorical question, if that's what's happening. Basically anything, strategically commencing with a visual, so that's fine as well. I've only listed a few here. This notion, so whatever the author is talking about, is reinforced early on in her piece. So, for example, the notion that cashless stores are great for society is reinforced early on in her piece through perhaps the visual or particular phrases. And some other ones here, you can have a read through these, but if you look at all of these, there is a common trend, and that's they refer to the location of the argument, which is the beginning. So they all refer to the fact that this paragraph is about the beginning of the author's argument. So that's why there's phrases such as in the forefront or early in her piece, initially recasting, deliberately engineered from the opening to, and so on. If you're wondering about what you can talk about for this first paragraph, some common points to talk about for the author's intent or why the author is doing something are as follows. So you can have a read through these, but I'm going to highlight that establishing credentials and rapport are your two most common things that you're going to see an author do at the beginning of their piece. Obviously, you don't just want to stop at establishing credentials. You want to have an analytical sentence. And something I used was the author attempts to establish credibility or rapport through and then insert your quote. And then, as your analytical part, you could say something like, this encourages audiences to be more receptive to the author's subsequent arguments regarding, and then insert what the author's subsequent arguments are. So that's usually something to do with the call to action or the purpose. Now, it's important to be specific, so don't just say encouraged to be more receptive to the author's arguments. You need to specify what the arguments are. That's why it's important to fill in that ... Hopefully that makes sense. And again, a lot of this is dependent on the article, but these are just some common things that you can look out for that, from my experience, showed up over and over again. And then for my linking sentence, there's not too many requirements for the link, but it's good to mention the purpose of the authors at this point in stage. So at the beginning of their argument, what is their purpose? Okay, moving on to paragraph 2, very similar structure. You can have a read of my topic sentence here and an example that shows this. But basically the important thing here is that for paragraph 2, you want a topic sentence that shows transition. And this is very often the case because authors don't have a static argument. So what I mean by that is that they don't have the same style for their entire piece. They're going to change. For example, they might change the argument type, the tone, the people that they're trying to appeal to. All these things change, and as a result, it's very important to pinpoint these differences. Now, there's no right or wrong answer with what you should point out, but as long as you point out something, that's better than not doing it at all. For this case, I like to use phrases such as embracing a more something argument, embracing a more, for example, future-orientated argument, turning to, so if it's turning to a different issue or a different aspect of an issue. And I wouldn't advise using this too often, but if the author does use the same approach and that's significant, then you can say continuing their argument type, their tone, their direct appeals to parents or whatever. But basically, that's just what author 1 is trying to do. And then that's contrasted against author 2. So that depends on what the actual article is. This is one example of doing so. Moving on from paragraph 1, which is kind of like the beginning of the author's article. Now we're moving into the middle part of the author's argument. And what does the author usually do in the middle? Well, one good thing to mention is this first sentence that I have here. So in order to advance to his or her ultimate intent in advocating for something, and then you can insert a quote or an idea. And basically what this means is that usually when an author is in the middle of her argument, they're trying to set up their solution up. So for example, that might present you with an issue, and then later on, they're going to present you with a solution. So in this case, since you've read the entire article, you kind of know what the author's ultimate intent is. So that's what the author wants us, the audience, to do. So just to use the 2019 paper as an example, Astaire's ultimate intent is to get everyone on board with cashless shopping. So for example, you could say something like, in order to achieve her ultimate intent of advocating for cashless shopping, the author tries to portray the benefits of cashless shopping through the phrases such as, and then insert your quote there. And this shows that you have a holistic understanding of the text, rather than viewing the article in separate segments. And below are some other examples that you can play around with. And just to give you some further examples, have a look at these two. These two are really great because they talk about the location and the position of one's argument. So, for example, the first one I've already mentioned before, and for the second one, having built up this established sympathy and anger, what does the author do? Well, the author uses this anger that has been built up, direct that towards politicians. So you can see how we're adding layers to our analysis here. We're not just saying that the author makes the audience angry, but why the author actually does that? Is it for another purpose? And in this case, it's to channel that anger towards politicians and therefore attack these politicians. So you can see that there's a lot of strategy involved in an author's argument. And then moving on to the link, I quite like this sentence structure for my linking sentence. And it is something that I used in almost every essay because I didn't want to spend time thinking of a new linking sentence every single time. So that's why I chose to be efficient and just use the same sentence stem every time. And here it is, and here is an example. Okay, final paragraph. The topic sentence here is usually something to do with the call to action. But other than that, the basic structure of this is very similar to the other one. So while author A says this, author B does that. And with the authorial intent, or basically the intent of the author, there's a couple of good sentences that usually always come up in the final section. So things like attempting not to alienate any audiences, to drive home his or her point, the cyclic structure. So these are all good phrases to use. And using some examples, for the first one, we can see that the cyclical structure, which just means that the author is returning to a point that they made at the beginning of their piece. So it's like coming full circle. And usually this is quite common in some of these VCAR pieces. And as for the actual analysis, that's not so much the important thing here, but you can have a read of that if you want. And then for the second example, strategically concluding. So that's another good phrase you can use. Now, I do want to mention one more thing for this final paragraph, because I can almost guarantee you this is going to save you a lot of time. In the final portion of an argument, the author usually uses inclusive language or has an inclusive tone. And this is almost present in every VCAR article. So it doesn't have to be inclusive language like we, our, although that is quite common. Even an inclusive tone is enough. And this is what we're going to use this for. We're going to come up with a structure that allows us to analyze inclusive language every single time that is both specific, but also general enough that we can apply it to most articles. Let's have a look. By inclusively stating, insert a quote, the author seeks to emphasize that it's a joint responsibility in, insert your purpose. The use of inclusive language may empower all audiences. Note how I specify all, because the author is not trying to alienate any audiences, but he or she is trying to unite every single audience to come together and have the same approach in, insert your purpose. So, for example, by inclusively repeating the phrase, we need, so that's inclusive language, we, the author seeks to emphasize that it's a joint responsibility in ensuring that their tweens, so their children, are safe while online. And this inclusive language may empower parents of tweens to come together and have the same approach in, and then the rest of that sentence is just the purpose of the text. Or in other words, what is the solution? So, every time I came across with inclusive language, I used this structure in red. And that saves so much time, because using this structure, you don't have to think too much about how you're going to phrase your sentence. You can pretty much just use the same sentence structure and then just substitute in whatever the author is actually talking about in the text. And very often, that's just run-along quotes. And then finally, we have our link. Again, nothing too special with this, but I do think that you should pay attention to the verbs here. So if you look at the verbs I use unite and mobilize. Both of these things are related to a call to action. So keep that in mind. And here is an example. Conclusion, this is probably your least important part. So I'm not going to spend too long on that. So here is my structure, and here is an example. But the structure is very flexible, so don't stress over the individual wording. I do want to touch on some vocab, because I talked about the importance of identifying the audience and also the argument type. So I'm going to give you some examples that you can use in your essays. So for audience types, there's some common terms, so audience, readers, readership, demographic, which are good terms to use. However, it's much better to put an adjective in front of your readers. If you can do this as frequently as possible, that would be the best. Here are some examples. So logical readers, emotionally charged readers, sentimental readers, humanitarian readers, so readers who care about human welfare, and some other ones here as well. And one thing that you can play around with is a lot of these audience types can be associated with particular paragraphs. For example, remember in paragraph 1 how we talked about credibility? Well, what is that credibility targeted towards? Well, it's targeted towards skeptical readers, because at the start of any piece, there's going to be skeptics. So that's why the author has to establish their credibility. And that's why in paragraph 1, not only do you have those sentence stems that I gave you, but you can also mention these key audience groups that always show up depending on the paragraph. So for example, skeptical readers, you can almost include that every time in paragraph 1. Or solution-orientated readers or conscientious readers. That's something you can use in paragraph 3, because these two audience groups are based on the actual solution of the author. And just to give you some argument types and approaches, here are some argument types on the left and approaches on the right. Now there's not much difference between an argument type and an approach. It just depends on the specific wording. So, for example, you usually say an alarmist approach, not an alarmist argument. So it's just a small nuanced thing with the actual wording of the argument, but there's not much difference in the actual meaning behind it. So here are some examples. Have a play around with these. And also, in my sample essay, there are examples of these, so see if you can spot these examples. So hopefully that makes sense how I use this template. And just as a final tip, it's up to you whether you want to use my template or if you want to create your own. I recommend that you do make some adjustments that suit your writing style and then practice using this template when writing. So for example, have it next to you when you're writing and make sure you try to use those phrases as much as possible, because as soon as it becomes ingrained, it's going to save you so much time. And hopefully you can also come up with these sentence and vocab banks. And the purpose of those is to basically pick and choose relevant pieces when you're given a new article. So there's not going to be a single template that you can use for every single essay, but there are those phrases and words that show up more often than others. And having a sentence or vocab bank is going to make your template more applicable to more pieces, to more articles. And that way, it's going to reduce the amount of thinking time if you set this template up well. And finally, regardless of whether you want to use a template or not, practice is the most important thing with argument analysis. So there are no shortcuts, but there are methods to make the process much easier.